5 identical girls, one silent mother, and a torn note that read, "We were never born. We were made." In the quiet outskirts of Maple Hollow, where the fog settles low over winding roads and time seems to slow near rusted fences and silent mailboxes, lived a man no one really knew. Nathan Walker kept to himself, an aging engineer, with calloused hands and eyes that once held brilliance, now dimmed by solitude. Each morning from his weathered porch, he watched a young woman named Rachel walk past with 5 identical lunchboxes, always in silence, always alone. Behind her, 5 little girls followed 5 faces so hauntingly alike, it stirred something long buried in Nathan's chest. They never spoke, never played, only clutched their lunchboxes like anchors in a sea of secrecy. No one else seemed to notice, or perhaps no one dared to. But Nathan did. And when one of those girls, barely taller than the railing she passed each day, slipped a torn piece of paper into his coat pocket that read, "Please help my mother," everything began to unravel. What started as quiet observation became a call to action, one that would change their lives and his forever. Maple Hollow was the kind of town that didn't show up on maps unless you already knew where to look. Tucked between dying cornfields and narrow county roads, it existed in a quiet pocket of Kentucky, where the wind always seemed to carry the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. It was late October, the trees along the main street burning orange and red like flickering embers, their leaves carpeting the sidewalks and whispering underfoot. Most of the houses stood in silence, porches sagging windows, fogged from within holding stories no one ever bothered to ask about. Nathan Walker had lived at the edge of Maple Hollow for 12 years, in a white clapboard house that looked like it had exhaled a long time ago and never remembered how to breathe again. He didn't speak to his neighbors. He didn't attend the church picnics or town parades. But every morning at precisely 7:02, he stood on his porch with a chipped mug of black coffee watching the world unfold, with the dull patience of someone who had seen too much and still not enough. That's when he saw her, Rachel, slender, fast-moving, and always carrying 5 identical lunchboxes. Behind her, 5 little girls trailed in near-perfect symmetry, same height, same long braids, same faded backpacks. They walked single file like shadows stitched to her heels, never laughing, never fighting, never once speaking. For weeks, Nathan assumed they were just part of some large homeschooling family, maybe cousins or adopted sisters. But something didn't feel right. Not with the way they clutched those lunch boxes like lifelines, not with the way they scanned the street like deer sensing danger. There was something too quiet about them, something too rehearsed. And Nathan, who hadn't cared about much in years, felt the first tremor of curiosity ripple under his skin. Nathan Walker hadn't always been a ghost in his own life. Years ago, he was a rising star in structural engineering, one of those men who spoke fluent math, sketched blueprints in the margins of napkins, and made a name for himself designing bridges that could withstand hurricanes and human error alike. He had lived in cities once, loud, fast cities with endless opportunity and no time to breathe, and for a while that suited him. But something broke, slowly and all at once. First came the sleepless nights, then the silence after phone calls that stopped coming, and eventually the resignation from a firm that no longer needed a man who had forgotten how to smile. After the accident, whatever it truly was, and no one in town knew the full truth, he disappeared from everything he had built. He bought the weather-beaten house at the edge of Maple Hollow with cash, told the realtor not to send mail, and spent the next decade fixing things that didn't need fixing. Old radios, broken clocks, a toaster that hadn't worked since 1987. The house was filled with machines that buzzed and clicked like a choir of forgotten time, each one giving Nathan a reason to keep his hands busy and his mind elsewhere. He didn't own a television. He barely checked his phone. His groceries were delivered once a week, and when he had to speak, he did so softly, like someone afraid his voice might wake the past. The neighbors called him the clock man, or that quiet guy, but most stopped referring to him at all. He preferred it that way. In solitude, there were no mistakes. In silence, there were no demands. He thought he had exiled himself for good until the day those 5 identical girls passed his porch and looked straight into him like they knew, like they remembered something he had long tried to forget. It started like a pattern Nathan hadn't meant to notice. Every morning at precisely 7:02, while the coffee burned his tongue and the porch creaked under his weight, she appeared always the same, always alone, except for the 5 little girls that followed her like petals on a vine. Rachel moved quickly, her eyes fixed forward, one hand gripping a canvas tote, and the other balancing 5 matching lunch boxes stacked neatly, their corners worn, but still cared for. Her movements were precise, practiced, almost mechanical, like someone used to being invisible and afraid of being noticed. She never looked up, never waved, never broke stride. The girls followed behind her in perfect silence, their footsteps barely audible on the gravel road. They didn't talk, didn't jostle, didn't show the normal chaos of siblings or children late for school. Instead, they walked in a narrow line. 5 heads, 5 long braids, 5 identical backpacks with little safety reflectors that caught the morning sun like blinking signals. Nathan watched them disappear down the road toward Maple Hollow Elementary, where the American flag hung limp beside a rusted bell tower, and where laughter should have echoed, but never did. At first, he thought little of it. Maybe Rachel was a mother of quintuplets, or maybe she ran a daycare and the girls just happened to look alike. But day after day, something kept pulling at him. The way she held those lunch boxes like they were fragile. The way the girls never looked at one another, only at her. The way the smallest one always lagged by half a step and glanced back at him. It wasn't just the symmetry that unsettled him. It was the silence, an unnatural quiet that followed them like a shadow, stretching longer with each passing morning until Nathan could no longer sip his coffee without waiting for it, without needing to know who they were and why they looked so afraid. The first time Nathan saw the girls walking home alone, it unsettled him more than he expected. It was nearly 3:15 in the afternoon, the same Thursday when the air had grown colder, and the wind carried a sharpness that hinted winter wasn't far behind. He had been fixing the hinge on the storm door when the sound of soft, synchronized footsteps drew his eyes toward the sidewalk. There they were, 5 identical girls walking side by side now, not in single file like the morning, but still without speaking, without smiling, without the slightest trace of childish energy. No adult accompanied them. Rachel, the woman who had carried their lunchboxes like sacred offerings, was nowhere in sight. The girls moved with eerie coordination, their small hands tucked into identical coat pockets, their heads bowed slightly against the breeze. Their backpacks bounced in rhythm, and for a fleeting second, Nathan wondered if he was watching a reel on repeat, some looped moment from earlier in the day, except now the sun was fading behind the trees, and they were alone. Entirely alone. They crossed the narrow street in perfect harmony, pausing briefly to glance in both directions, with almost unnatural timing, like they'd been trained, not taught. And again, it was the smallest girl, the one who always trailed by half a step, who turned her head as they passed his yard. Her eyes met his, just for a second, and in that second, Nathan felt something that wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was dread. Children that young shouldn't walk home by themselves, certainly not in that silence, certainly not every single day. But there they were, as predictable as clockwork, vanishing into the same alleyway behind the shuttered hardware store, one by one, without looking back. Except her. The smallest one always looked back. By the end of the 3rd week, Nathan's curiosity had curdled into something heavier, something darker, restless, and unnamed. He told himself he wasn't spying, just observing from the same porch he always sat on, but deep down he knew better. Something about those girls, about their perfect silence and identical movements, refused to fade into the background like everything else in Maple Hollow. He began to notice patterns. They always passed at exactly 7:02 a.m. and 3:14 p.m. Always five. Always dressed the same, even when the weather shifted suddenly and others in town scrambled for coats or umbrellas. Their expressions never changed. They didn't argue, didn't laugh, didn't even whisper among themselves like other children did. Nathan had lived long enough in quiet to recognize when it wasn't natural. And the woman Rachel, she was strange in her own way. Too careful, too fast, too invisible. He never saw her speak to a neighbor, never saw her outside of those few moments each morning. There was no car in her driveway, no packages at her door, no sign of life behind her drawn curtains. One night, unable to sleep, Nathan walked down the street just to look. Her house was dark, yet the television flickered blue behind a slit in the blinds, and shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense. The next day, Rachel didn't appear, but the 5 girls still did, walking alone, their lunchboxes held by the tallest one. That was when the suspicion solidified into something undeniable. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a strange family or a private woman. There was something off in the rhythm, like a song being played just slightly out of tune. Nathan, once a man who ran from complications, now found himself counting footsteps, memorizing details, waiting for answers he hadn't admitted he needed. It was on a gray-skied Monday when the wind whipped stronger than usual, and the trees along Maple Hollow's main road had begun shedding leaves like silent warnings that Nathan finally acted on the weight that had been pressing against his chest for days. He didn't plan it, not really. He simply baked something he hadn't done in years, peanut butter cookies, the kind that used to make his niece laugh when she was small, and placed them gently into a tin with a paper towel folded beneath. At precisely 3:14, when the 5 girls appeared at the end of the street, he walked out to the edge of his porch and called out softly, not wanting to startle them. "Hi there, you girls like cookies?" His voice cracked from disuse, and for a heartbeat they froze. All 5 pairs of feet stopped in perfect unison. The tallest girl looked at the others, then back at him. It was the smallest one who took a cautious step forward, her eyes locked on his with a kind of old suspicion that didn't belong in a child's face. "They're fresh," he added gently, lifting the tin and offering a warm smile, trying not to move too fast. "No tricks. Just cookies." After a long pause, they approached together, slow measured, like a flock of birds unsure whether to trust a human hand. Each of them looked exactly the same, down to the faint scar above their right brow and the way their fingers curled in when they walked. But up close, Nathan noticed differences. Tiny ones. The tallest had a faint smudge of dirt on her right cheek. One blinked more often. Another chewed her lower lip when nervous. They didn't speak. Not one word. But when he opened the tin, they each took a cookie in perfect order, starting with the tallest and ending with the smallest, who hesitated before accepting hers. Nathan didn't push conversation. He simply watched as they nibbled quietly, standing in a neat row along his fence, their eyes never quite meeting his. Something in their silence screamed louder than words ever could. As the days passed and the cookies became a quiet ritual, Nathan began to see them not just as copies of each other, but as individuals stitched together by something deeper than genetics. Each girl, while identical in appearance, held a different rhythm, a different pulse, just beneath the surface. Emma was the quietest always, the first to step forward and the last to leave. She never spoke, never reacted to Nathan's gentle attempts at conversation, but her eyes often drifted upward, as if the sky held answers no one else could see. She'd stand still, cookie untouched, watching the clouds drift like ghosts over Maple Hollow, her thoughts clearly far away. Sophie, in contrast, was the first to ask questions, not many, and never carelessly. "Why do dogs bark louder when the moon's full?" she asked once, her tone flat but her eyes sharp. "Do people age the same on airplanes?" Nathan didn't know how to answer most of them, and she never asked the same thing twice. Abby always had a notebook in hand, one that seemed older than she was, its corners frayed, and the spiral half unwound. She never drew people, only doors, keys, fences, and locks. Once Nathan caught a glimpse of a page and saw a drawing of his house scrawled in charcoal pencil, eerily exact down to the broken shutter on the top left window. Maya never looked up from her book even when chewing. She held novels like they were lifelines, and though Nathan never saw her flip a page, the titles changed each week. One afternoon, while the others ate in silence, she read Jane Eyre with her pinky pressed against the paragraph as if tracking every syllable. And then there was Chloe, the smallest, the last to speak but always the first to notice. Chloe didn't watch the world, she watched Nathan. She watched how he stood, how he held the cookie tin, how his fingers trembled when he reached for a cup. She didn't trust easily, and her gaze, steady, clinical, often made him pause mid-sentence. He could feel her measuring him as if trying to decide whether he was safe enough to remember. These weren't ordinary girls. Nathan felt it in his bones, and for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to care. It was a late Thursday afternoon, the kind where the light spilled like golden syrup across the pavement, and the trees glowed with fading amber. Nathan had just finished sweeping the fallen leaves from his front steps when he saw them again. 5 girls walking single file, their backpacks bouncing rhythmically, eyes down, voices silent. But this time, Rachel was there. She stood at the end of the road, hands shoved deep into her coat pockets, sunglasses pressed tightly to her face despite the waning light. Nathan hadn't seen her up close in weeks, not since the day he'd watched her from behind the curtain as she rushed out of the school with the 5 identical lunchboxes. Now she looked smaller, somehow thinner, as if the weight of whatever she carried had pressed her into herself. Nathan hesitated, then stepped off his porch and approached with careful steps. "Hi," he offered, his voice soft, measured. "I've been seeing your girls around. They're remarkable." Rachel stiffened, her shoulders pulled in. "They're just kids," she said quickly, not meeting his eyes. He nodded, trying again. "I only meant they're polite, quiet, bright." He glanced at Sophie, who immediately looked away. "I offered them cookies a few times. Hope that's okay." For a second, her jaw tensed so tightly he thought she might snap. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, placed one hand on Chloe's shoulder and the other on Maya's backpack strap, and gently but firmly began guiding them away. "They don't talk to strangers," she said over her shoulder, tone clipped and final. Nathan raised a hand. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," she interrupted, not slowing her pace. "But don't offer them food again." The girls followed, not resisting their eyes, glancing back just once, Emma's gaze lingering a moment longer than the others. Nathan stood there, leaves rustling around his boots, heart thudding. Rachel hadn't just been protective, she'd been afraid. And that fear didn't come from caution. It came from knowing something. Something she didn't want him or anyone else to see. That night, long after the sun had slipped behind the hills and the wind carried the first real bite of approaching winter, Nathan sat at his kitchen table staring at the fading steam rising from his untouched coffee. He couldn't stop thinking about Rachel's eyes, sharp-guarded, almost panicked, and the 5 identical girls who moved like practiced shadows. Something about it all gnawed at him, a puzzle with too many pieces missing. It wasn't just the resemblance. It wasn't even their silence. It was the way Rachel had pulled them away like someone shielding a secret, not just a child. So Nathan did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his laptop, dusted off the old bookmarks from a life before seclusion, and began searching. At first, it was innocent Maple Hollow Elementary Staff Records District directories. Rachel's name didn't appear as a teacher, an aide, or even as a registered guardian. That struck him as strange. She brought lunchboxes every morning, picked them up without signing anything. Yet she wasn't listed. He kept going. Property records, census, data town registries. Maple Hollow wasn't exactly bustling with bureaucracy, but small towns had their own ways of keeping track. And yet, there was no Rachel Walters listed in the town records. No leases, no utilities, no driver's license address in town. As if she had appeared from nowhere, Nathan rubbed his temples. Maybe she lived just outside town lines. Maybe she was staying with a friend. But even then, 5 school-aged children, identical, no news, no adoption records, no birth announcements, no chatter. In a town this small, someone always talked. Someone always knew. He dug deeper this time through archived local newspapers, obituaries, old social announcements, and nothing turned up. Not a whisper of quintuplets. No fundraiser for a mother of 5, no mention of a birth miracle or family tragedy. The kind of thing that would have made front-page news, anywhere, especially here. The silence was too complete, too orchestrated. Nathan leaned back in his chair, heart heavier than before. Something didn't add up. And whatever Rachel was hiding, he had a growing uneasy feeling it wasn't just about protecting her daughters. It was about hiding them. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the wind shifted, the kind of crisp, trembling wind that made dry leaves skitter across porches like whispered secrets. Nathan had just returned from a supply run to the edge of town, groceries clinking in canvas bags, when he slipped his hand into the pocket of his jacket and felt the unmistakable texture of paper. It wasn't there that morning. His fingers stiffened, and he slowly pulled it out, a small, crumpled piece barely bigger than a receipt. His eyes scanned the handwriting, shaky, uncertain, written in pencil, and smudged at the corners as though clutched too tightly. 5 words, uneven and trembling like a cry trapped in silence. Please help my mother. E. Nathan froze. For a moment he simply stood there, his breath catching. The air around him stilled. He turned toward the road instinctively, as if expecting to see a figure running away, but there was nothing, just the fading sound of wind and the distant bark of a dog. He opened the note again. Please help my mother. He didn't need to guess who the E was. It had to be Emma, the quietest of the 5, the one who always looked up at the sky, who had barely met his eyes when he offered them cookies last week. Somehow she had gotten close enough to slip this into his jacket, and had trusted him, a stranger behind a porch railing, more rust than wood, with something that sounded like desperation. Nathan's mind raced. Why would a child write that? Was Rachel in danger? Were the girls being harmed? Was someone threatening them? But nothing about Rachel had ever suggested violence, only fear, exhaustion, and a kind of watchful panic. He reread the note 3 more times, heart pounding now, not with curiosity, but urgency. This wasn't a mystery to be solved from behind a screen anymore. This was a plea, a signal. And if a child was brave enough to reach out through fear, then the least he could do after years of hiding from his own failures was to answer. The next morning, Nathan waited by the gate instead of his porch, his breath clouding in the autumn air, fists deep in his coat pockets, the crumpled note weighing on his conscience like a stone. When Rachel appeared, her face pale and distant, walking ahead of the 5 identical girls, as always, he stepped forward. She flinched at the sight of him. Rachel, he said, his voice low but firm. We need to talk. She tried to smile politely and move past him, but he blocked her path. One of them gave me this. He continued, unfolding the note and holding it out. Her eyes darted to it, then away, as if it burned. I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on. Rachel's entire body stiffened. The girls stood behind her in silence. Emma at the front, eyes wide with something between fear and hope. You don't understand, Rachel said quietly, her voice shaking. Then help me understand, Nathan urged. 5 girls, no birth records, no father, no one picks them up. They walk to and from school like ghosts. And now this, he waved the note. Rachel, if you're in trouble, if they're in danger, you have to say something. She looked at him, then really looked like someone at the edge of a cliff staring into the storm. It's not what you think, she whispered. Then tell me what it is, Nathan said. Because I've been silent too long in my life, and I won't be silent while a child begs me to help her mother. Rachel's composure cracked. Tears welled and her voice trembled. If I speak, I lose them. If I stay quiet, I lose myself. The girls clung to each other, now sensing the shift, their eyes locked on Rachel, on Nathan, on the fragile boundary between truth and danger. He stepped closer. Then let's find another way together. But please, don't shut me out. Not now. And with that, the walls she'd built so carefully began to tremble. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, but every word felt like a thunderclap inside Nathan's chest as she finally began to speak. Her hands trembling in her lap, while the girls sat quietly in the next room, unaware that their entire truth was unraveling just behind the thin kitchen wall. I wasn't always Rachel, she said, eyes fixed on a spot in the distance that only she could see. 10 years ago, I was Nurse Leanne Foster, assigned to a classified genetic research project under the Department of Biomedical Advancement. It was called Project Echo, buried so deep in the system that even most of the doctors didn't know who was funding it. They told us we were working on developmental therapies for rare neurodivergent conditions. But that was only the surface. The real work was darker. It was about replication, controlled replication. She paused, swallowing hard. The girls weren't born, they were made, grown from manipulated embryos designed to be identical in form but varied in cognitive function. 5 strands of one thread each, with a different neurological emphasis: observation, emotion, reasoning, memory, and instinct. They were labeled as assets, not children, units, data sets. The moment I realized what we were doing, when I saw the schedule for Phase 4, I couldn't stay silent. Phase 4 was surgical. They were going to dissect the girls' brains while they were still alive to observe real-time neural behavior. They called it a necessary sacrifice for national progress. Her voice cracked. They were 3 years old. They had names. They laughed. They cried. I couldn't let it happen. Nathan sat frozen as she continued, tears streaking down her face. So I ran. I stole them in the middle of the night during a system-wide power failure, faked a car crash, burned the records. We've been running ever since. New names, small towns always moving. But they're getting closer. I know it. One of them must have seen something. That's why the note. She finally looked at Nathan, her voice raw with desperation. They're not safe. And now neither are you. Rachel stood in the dim light of the kitchen, her silhouette trembling as though the weight of her secret might crush her at any moment. Her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, and years of silent fear met Nathan's and held him there, not with force, but with a desperate, pleading vulnerability that struck deeper than any demand could have. Please, she whispered, her voice hoarse and frayed. You can't tell anyone. Not the sheriff, not your old friends at the Department of Defense. No one. If you say a word, they'll find us. They'll come in the night and take them. Nathan said nothing, but his face was carved in stunned disbelief, torn between everything he thought he knew about the world and the new, impossible reality now sitting before him. Rachel moved closer, lowering her voice even more, as though the walls might betray her. You saw them, Nathan. You've seen how they are. They're not dangerous. They're children. Smart, strange, yes, but full of life, of questions and wonder. They've never hurt anyone. All I've ever done is try to protect them from a world that sees them as tools, not daughters. Her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white. I know what I did was illegal. I know I've lied to everyone. But if you say anything, they'll be taken apart, studied like insects, erased from existence. They'll say it was for science, for progress. But you and I both know what that means. They'll disappear. And no one will even ask why. She stepped back, her eyes wet but unblinking. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to protect them. Just by staying silent, just by letting us be. I'll disappear again if I have to. But if you care at all, if any part of you sees them the way I do, then please don't speak. Let them live. The quiet rhythm of Maple Hollow was shattered one overcast morning when a sleek black SUV with tinted windows rolled down Main Street, its polished exterior reflecting the sleepy storefronts and the wide-eyed stares of townspeople unused to such intrusion. Nathan watched from his porch as the vehicle pulled up outside the old municipal building, now rarely used, except during town meetings or fall festivals. 3 individuals stepped out. 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in sharp suits. Their movements precise, almost clinical. There was something deeply unsettling about their presence, a sterile efficiency that clashed violently with the rustic charm of the town. The woman, tall with a severe ponytail and an earpiece tucked discreetly under her hair, glanced around with thinly veiled disdain before nodding to her colleagues. Nathan's gut twisted. He didn't need to see their badges to know where they were from. Stonewell Biotech. Rachel had mentioned them once, only briefly, like the whisper of a nightmare she couldn't quite suppress. He had hoped, prayed that her fear was rooted in paranoia, not truth, but the arrival of these people made everything real. The townsfolk, curious but cautious, watched from behind windows and half-closed doors as the trio entered the building. Rumors began to swirl almost instantly. Some said they were investors. Others whispered about a federal investigation. But Nathan knew. This wasn't business. This was a hunt. Their presence wasn't random. It was targeted, calculated. And if they were here, it meant they were already too close. His mind raced. How had they tracked Rachel? The girl's a mistake, a footprint, a data breach. Stonewell didn't move without purpose, and they didn't stop once they started. As the SUV's engine cooled in the morning air, Nathan felt the first true pang of fear, not for himself, but for the children who had once looked up at him with eyes full of silent hope. Nathan sat at his kitchen table, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor as he flipped through the thin manila folder Rachel had left behind. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet mounting horror of what he was seeing. There were no birth certificates, no adoption papers, no legal documentation linking Rachel to the 5 girls she claimed as her daughters. Each time he expected to turn a page and find a shred of legitimacy, a hospital record, a guardianship order, even a forged signature, he was met instead with blank space or cleverly constructed fabrications that collapsed under scrutiny. Rachel had done her best to cover their tracks, but Stonewell had better tools, deeper databases, and far more power. According to the state of Kentucky, the children didn't exist. And Rachel Powell. She was a ghost. Her nursing license had been revoked 8 years ago, citing unethical conduct and security breach, but there were no public records of criminal charges or trial. It was as if the entire system had agreed to quietly erase her, just enough to make her disappear, but not enough to raise suspicion. Nathan's breath caught when he reached the last page, a photocopy of a nameless hospital transfer record, dated the same month Rachel had vanished from her post at a military-affiliated research clinic in New Mexico. The initials on the page matched the code Rachel had mumbled in her sleep more than once, Pax Gen 07. Now it was starting to make sense. The girls hadn't been born into this world. They'd been created, cataloged, and when deemed unviable, scheduled for termination. Rachel hadn't just stolen them. She had saved them. But without legal ties, without documentation, she was nothing more than a fugitive with 5 undocumented children. If Stonewell found them now, there would be no courtroom, no appeal, no protection. Nathan closed the folder slowly. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint rustle of dry leaves and the sound of approaching footsteps. It began on a Thursday morning, cloaked in golden mist, the kind of fall air that made Maple Hollow seem almost enchanted until the black SUVs rolled up in front of the elementary school like a silent, coiled threat. Nathan had just poured his coffee when he saw them through his window, government-plated vehicles with tinted glass and men in suits stepping out, their movements crisp and calculated, their expressions devoid of warmth. Within minutes, the schoolyard, normally filled with the chaotic joy of children rushing into the day, fell into stunned silence as teachers were quietly summoned to the office and uniformed officers handed over sealed court orders. Inside, 5 little girls sat side by side in the cafeteria, eating their identical peanut butter sandwiches, unaware that fate had come for them. Chloe was the first to notice something was wrong, her eyes scanning the hallway, narrowing at the unnatural hush. Maya closed her book mid-sentence. Abby clutched her sketch pad. Emma looked to the ceiling as if she could will it away. Sophie whispered something under her breath that made Chloe nod. Then the strangers arrived, flanked by local law enforcement, who seemed just as confused but unwilling to interfere. One man read the court order aloud, though no one truly listened. The girls didn't cry, didn't scream. They simply stood like 5 soldiers trained for a battle. No child should ever face, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, waiting for Rachel, who never came. Word spread through Maple Hollow in whispers. Some said it was Child Protective Services, others said it was Homeland Security. Only Nathan knew the truth. This wasn't rescue, it was reclamation. The experiment had returned to collect its data. As the last SUV pulled away with the 5 girls inside, Nathan dropped his coffee cup, the porcelain shattering on the floor as he reached for his keys. He wasn't going to let them disappear, not without a fight. Rachel arrived just as the final SUV door was about to close, her lungs burning from the sprint across town, her shoes soaked in dew, her voice already raw from screaming their names. But it was too late. 2 security agents blocked her path, their hands firm but professional as they pushed her back, repeating the same rehearsed line. "Ma'am, you need to stand down." She didn't. She lunged forward, desperate, wild-eyed, clawing through their arms, yelling, "They're my daughters," as if that declaration alone could break government protocol. The girls had spotted her through the tinted windows. Chloe banged on the glass with her fists. Maya screamed "Mama" until her voice cracked. Abby's sketchpad fell to the ground outside the car, pages fluttering like lost feathers. Sophie's sharp eyes darted back and forth, trying to assess an exit route, while holding tightly to Emma, who had begun to sob uncontrollably. The sound of their cries, fractured, terrified, familiar, ripped through the parking lot like a storm, echoing off brick walls and silencing the watching crowd. Teachers cried. Students froze. A janitor dropped his mop and whispered, "This isn't right." Rachel collapsed to her knees as the engine roared to life. The vehicle inched forward, but she crawled bloodied from the pavement until someone held her down. Her fingers stretched across the ground as if sheer will could halt steel and rubber. "You promised," she cried to no one in particular, her voice breaking guttural. "I saved them." The girls pressed their hands to the glass. Chloe mouthed something, but Rachel couldn't read her lips through the tears. And then they were gone. Just like that. The quiet returned, but it was the kind of silence that comes after a scream. Rachel lay motionless on the asphalt, surrounded by the shattered remnants of everything she had fought to protect, and Maple Hollow, once a sleepy town of secrets, would never be the same again. Nathan arrived seconds after the SUVs pulled away, gravel skidding beneath his boots, adrenaline screaming through his veins. He had seen the chaos from across the street, the screaming children, Rachel's collapse, the officials with earpieces and dark jackets, and without thinking, he ran straight into the fray. "Where are they taking them?" he demanded, pushing past a line of teachers and stunned parents. But before he could reach the edge of the lot, a tall man in a gray suit stepped forward and blocked his path, flashing a badge that read, "Stonewell Biotech Legal Division." "Sir, step back. You have no legal standing in this matter." Nathan's jaw tightened. "They're just children. I know them." And you are not their guardian," the man interrupted calmly with the authority of someone who had said this line 100 times before. Another agent flanked him, younger, stockier, with a hand resting casually but unmistakably on a concealed holster. Nathan bristled. "You can't just take them. There has to be a process, some kind of hearing." There was the first man said evenly. "Emergency family court. Sealed. Due to the classified nature of the children's genetic background." The words hung in the air like poison. "Classified?" Nathan repeated, stunned. "They're 5 little girls, not state secrets." But even as he said it, he saw the truth in the agent's stillness, their rehearsed responses, their practiced indifference. Behind them, a teacher gently helped Rachel to her feet, her face drained of color, her hands shaking. Nathan tried to push past again, but this time 2 more agents blocked him. "You interfere again, sir, and we'll be forced to treat you as a security threat." And just like that, he was powerless. A man with no legal tie, no document, no bloodline, just a neighbor, a bystander, a witness to something monstrous. As the gates of the schoolyard shut behind the convoy, Nathan stood frozen wind cutting across his face, the last echoes of the girls' cries still alive in the autumn air. Nathan didn't sleep that night. The image of the girls being dragged into black SUVs haunted him. Emma's silent tears. Sophie's fists pounding against the window. Chloe's eyes locked on his as if pleading for something he couldn't give. Rachel had collapsed on the pavement, inconsolable, clutching at air, as if her arms could still hold them. Nathan sat at his kitchen table until sunrise, hands clenched, mind racing, searching for any legal foothold. By 8 a.m., he was standing inside the county clerk's office with a stack of forms and a trembling voice, explaining to the bewildered clerk that he wanted to petition for emergency guardianship of the 5 girls taken from Maple Hollow Elementary the day before. He had never done anything like this before, but he knew what he felt: responsibility, urgency, and something deeper he couldn't name. The clerk frowned sympathetically and told him to wait. Hours passed. He was sent from one office to another, filling out affidavits explaining his involvement, even bringing in a character witness, Mrs. Langford, the school secretary, who'd seen him share his lunch with the girls. But by late afternoon, the answer came back swift and cold: denied. The reason typed neatly at the top of the rejection letter struck him like a slap. Petitioner possesses no biological or legal connection to the minors in question, and thus lacks standing to request custody or guardianship. Nathan argued, begged, pleaded, but the system was unmoved. A blood test, a marriage license, an adoption certificate — without one of these, he was invisible to the court. Just a man with no last name to match theirs, no legal claim, no power. When he asked where the girls had been taken, he was told the records were sealed. When he asked who now had custody, he was told it was a matter of national confidentiality. Nathan walked out of the courthouse into the fading light, rejection letter in hand, heart pounding with helpless rage, and made a vow that even if the system refused to see him, he would never stop seeing them. The next morning, as Nathan stepped out to get the newspaper from his porch, he froze. There it was, printed in bold black letters across the front page of the Maple Hollow Gazette: "Mysterious man spotted near unregistered children, security concerns rise." His stomach dropped. Underneath the headline was a blurry photograph zoomed in from a distance: Nathan sitting on the school bench handing a cookie to Sophie, who was laughing while Chloe looked on cautiously. The caption read, "Local man seen engaging multiple minor females outside school premises. No familial ties confirmed." The article went on to imply suspicions of inappropriate interest, veiled carefully in passive language and loaded insinuations. It mentioned concerning reports from anonymous school sources stated that the man has no legal relationship with the children, and posed rhetorical questions about whether local authorities were doing enough to protect vulnerable minors. Rachel was only mentioned once, referred to vaguely as a woman previously associated with a biotech facility, a detail meant to raise eyebrows rather than explain truth. There was no mention of the court denial, no acknowledgement of the custody battle or the emergency guardianship request. Instead, the piece painted a portrait of a reclusive outsider, Nathan Walker, the lonely man who rarely spoke to neighbors, who once worked in classified government projects, now suddenly showing interest in 5 identical children. It framed him as a potential threat, cloaked in the appearance of concern. By noon, other outlets picked it up. A regional channel broadcasted a segment titled, "Who is Nathan Walker?" using the same photo and ominous voiceover. At the grocery store, people avoided his eyes. A mother clutched her child tighter when he walked past. Nathan's inbox filled with vague threats and questions he couldn't answer. The world had twisted his quiet acts of kindness into a spectacle of suspicion. The girls were gone, Rachel unreachable, and now even the town had turned its back on him. But Nathan knew the truth wasn't in the headlines. It was in Emma's skyward gaze, Abby's sketchbook, Maya's book, Sophie's questions, Chloe's silent watchfulness. And that truth, though buried, was worth digging for, no matter how deep. Rachel sat alone in the back corner of a run-down motel room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, the soft flicker of the television casting distorted shadows on the stained wallpaper. Her face was pale, drawn, hollowed by days without sleep, and a heart bruised beyond recognition. The screen showed her face again, her old hospital ID photo from a decade ago flashed beside the chilling headline, "Former nurse wanted for child abduction." Beneath it, a newscaster reported that Rachel May Collins was being investigated for stealing 5 genetically modified children from a now-defunct biotech facility and raising them under false identities. Armed and dangerous, the anchor read, as though she were a fugitive on the run, not a woman who had once rocked those girls to sleep when their bodies seized under machines, who had once held Sophie's hand through a fever, who had pulled Abby away from screaming nightmares of cold rooms and sharp lights. Her phone buzzed again, a message from someone she once trusted. "I'm sorry, Rach, but I can't talk to you right now. It's too risky." Another buzz. "They're saying you brainwashed them. You need to turn yourself in." But Rachel couldn't even move. The weight pressing down on her chest was too heavy. She'd risked everything to save the girls from being disassembled intellectually, neurologically, even physically. And now the world had decided she was the monster. She wasn't a mother, they said. Not legally, not biologically. Just a thief of lives too complicated to understand. She remembered the moment she first decided to run, how little Emma had clutched her sleeve and whispered, "I don't want to go back in the white room." That single sentence had rewritten her future. And now here she was, a kidnapper stripped of name, dignity, and purpose. She no longer existed as the quiet caretaker of 5 extraordinary girls. She had been rewritten as a threat to public safety. The girls were gone. Nathan was under fire, and Rachel, once their silent protector, had become the world's villain. She buried her face in her arms and let the tears fall, not just from fear, but from the unbearable knowledge that telling the truth now would cost the girls everything. Nathan sat in his study long after midnight, the glow of his desk lamp casting harsh lines across documents he had once never imagined touching: legal filings, custody petitions, precedent cases, and human rights clauses he had printed from every corner of state and federal law. The house was quiet, yet his mind roared. The image of Chloe screaming as she was dragged from Rachel's arms would not leave him. Neither would the look in Rachel's eyes, defeated, hollow, as if the weight of the world had crushed something irretrievably soft inside her. He had tried to follow the rules, submit the paperwork, speak kindly to the officials, trust that the truth would find its way through the cracks. But it hadn't. The system didn't care about quiet truths or what love looked like. The court had slammed its door shut, citing lack of biological relation, lack of legal standing, lack of precedent. But what they lacked was vision, and Nathan had finally accepted that he couldn't stand by another moment hoping others would act. He was no longer the outsider who stumbled into this story. He was in it now, blood or no blood. He closed the file labeled "Motion to Intervene" and opened a fresh legal pad, writing with slow, deliberate strokes, "Petition for protective custody based on imminent harm." The girls were not just being taken. They were being returned to a place that once viewed their minds as property, their potential as something to harvest. He had seen enough, learned enough, risked enough to know that standing on the sidelines was over. He would go public if needed. He would expose Stonewell Biotech and every signature that authorized what had been done. He would put his reputation, his resources, and his voice on the line, because silence was no longer protection, it was complicity. Rachel had saved those girls once. Now it was his turn. No more caution. No more permission. The law had denied them a family. Nathan would use that same law to reclaim it. For Emma, who always looked at the sky. For Sophie, Abby, Maya, and Chloe. He would not let the world erase them. Not while he was still breathing. Inside the sterile, windowless walls of the Stonewell Developmental Research Center, life for the 5 girls shifted into something clinical, cold, and deeply controlled. Each of them was separated into individual rooms that looked less like dormitories and more like observation chambers, identical beds, mounted cameras, white fluorescent lights that hummed endlessly. On the first day, a nurse in a crisp gray uniform injected a small device beneath each girl's skin just below the collarbone. For safety and compliance, she said without emotion, as if they were livestock in a high-security farm. The girls weren't told what it was, but Maya, ever the reader, recognized the handheld scanner the nurse used, RFID tracking. They had been chipped like assets. After that, their movement was restricted to assigned areas, a monitored classroom, a cafeteria, where they had to eat in silence, and brief recreation periods that felt more like psychological evaluations disguised as games. There were no phone calls, no letters, no mention of Rachel. Every time one of the girls asked to speak with someone outside, they were met with the same icy response: "Your guardian situation is under review. You're here for your own good." But the girls knew better. They watched the adults watching them, scientists with clipboards who never smiled, who whispered behind mirrored glass, who logged every sentence, every reaction. Abby clutched her drawing pad like a lifeline, sketching furiously in corners when no one watched. Sophie whispered questions to herself, rehearsing escape plans in her head. Emma became even quieter, gazing not at the sky now, but at the ceiling, as if looking for something beyond. Chloe stared down every adult with growing suspicion, and Maya stopped reading. That terrified the others more than anything. In the silence of their confinement, the girls began to resist the only way they could, through words. Late at night, under the thin blankets of their assigned beds, each of them began writing letters to Nathan, the only adult outside who had shown them kindness without condition, the only one who had seen them as children and not anomalies. Maya wrote first, tearing pages from the back of a textbook and scribbling in tiny, deliberate print. "Dear Mr. Nathan," she began, "please don't forget us. We remember everything you said. We're trying to stay strong, but they won't let us talk to anyone, not even each other." Emma's letter was fewer words but heavy with emotion. "You said the sky is still there even when we can't see it. I keep looking. I think it misses us too." Sophie's was analytical, describing their schedule like a scientist, hoping Nathan would pick up clues. "We're monitored every hour. No electronics. Meals are numbered. They call us by code, not name." Abby drew her letter, a map of the facility from memory, complete with arrows pointing to where they thought the main doors were, accompanied by a sketch of Nathan's kind eyes and the words, "Find us." Chloe's letter was more direct. "They took Rachel. Everyone thinks she's bad, but she saved us. Please make them see." The girls folded their messages carefully, hiding them inside books, pillowcases, socks. One by one, they tried slipping them into laundry bins or under cafeteria trays, praying someone kind might find them and pass them on. But the center was built for control. Every item was scanned, every scrap inspected, every letter confiscated. The girls never knew how many actually made it out, if any. But still they wrote, because writing meant hope, and hope was all they had left. It was Chloe who decided to take the risk. After seeing every letter they wrote being confiscated or torn apart, she realized they needed something different, something softer, less obvious, something that looked like comfort, but carried truth. Her teddy bear, a frayed little thing she had clutched since Rachel first handed it to her years ago, seemed harmless enough. It had survived shelters, bus rides, and sleepless nights. The seams were loose from love, the fur matted from years of small arms wrapping around it every night. It was the one thing the staff didn't take away. So Chloe waited until lights out, when the cameras blinked slower and the guards grew lazy with routine. She pulled a letter from under her mattress, folded with precision, and carefully sliced a small tear along the stitching of the bear's back with the sharp edge of a broken toothbrush handle. She tucked the note deep inside, gently pushing the cotton aside, then stitched the hole closed with thread she'd hidden in the cuff of her sock. The next morning she carried the bear with her to the scheduled therapy block, holding it tighter than usual. She didn't say a word, but her eyes had hope in them. That was her mistake. Hope always caught their attention. One of the attendants, a new face wearing a crisp white badge and fake smile, tilted his head and said, "What's in the bear?" "Chloe." She froze. "Nothing," she whispered. He took it from her gently, then forcefully. Minutes later, in front of the other children, he cut open the bear with scissors and pulled out the hidden letter. Silence followed. Then the alarms. Chloe was grabbed by 2 guards and taken down the hall as the other children cried her name. No one was allowed to ask where she went. No one saw her at dinner. For 3 days her bed stayed empty, and every child knew speaking, writing, even hoping too loud meant punishment. But somewhere deep down, they also knew Chloe had tried, and that meant maybe, just maybe, someone would come. At night, when the lights dimmed and the halls of the sterile facility fell silent except for the occasional hum of electric locks and distant footsteps, the 5 girls lay in their assigned bunks, each in a separate room, the walls too thick for whispers and the ceilings too high for dreams. Their minds, however, were anything but still. Emma lay staring at the ceiling, her small hands clenched at her sides, her eyes blinking slowly as she remembered the sound of Rachel's laughter when they danced barefoot in the rain behind the farmhouse. She remembered the way Nathan always crouched to meet her gaze, not just to speak, but to listen like she mattered. Now no one looked her in the eye. Sophie buried her face in the stiff pillow, thinking of the books Nathan had brought them, the ones she devoured in one sitting, the way he challenged her questions instead of dismissing them. "Why did they take us?" she had whispered once to a wall. "What did we do wrong?" But there were no answers, just the silence of exile. Abby, who once filled pages with wild sketches and dreams of trees that spoke, now stared at her blank notebook, the pencil confiscated days ago. She mouthed Rachel's name over and over like a prayer, hoping it might reach the outside somehow. Maya sat in the corner of her room, knees to chest, bookless for the first time in years, whispering facts to herself, dates, chemical formulas, names of stars, as if the structure might keep her from unraveling. But nothing could explain why the only people who ever showed them love were gone. And Chloe, though returned from isolation, was changed. She no longer cried, no longer asked questions. But at night she traced the seams of her new bear with her finger and mouthed one word silently into the dark: Nathan. They didn't understand the separation, didn't know about court orders or fabricated records or corporate ownership. All they knew was that their world had been torn apart by people who never said why. And every heartbeat now pulsed with one aching question: when would they be whole again? Imagine you're 8 years old, and one morning you're eating oatmeal while your mother hums in the kitchen and the man who reads you bedtime stories is fixing a leaky pipe. You feel safe. You feel seen. Now imagine just a week later you're in a white room that smells like bleach and nothing else. The windows don't open. The doors click every time they close. No one calls you by your nickname. Your drawings are thrown away. Your questions are ignored. You aren't allowed to talk to your sisters, and when you whisper their names through the vents, no one answers. You don't know what court order means or why a stranger took your hand and said, "It's time to come with us." You only know that Rachel didn't get to say goodbye, that her voice screaming your name as she was pushed away plays over and over in your head like a broken song. The man they called unauthorized Nathan is someone you still dream about because he knelt down and tied your shoe and said, "You matter." You don't understand why he's not allowed to visit. You don't understand why you're being punished when you didn't do anything wrong. The adults talk like you're not in the room. They poke, they test, they observe. But no one asks, "Are you okay?" So you stop talking. You start counting tiles, tracing cracks, making stories out of dust motes, because stories are the only place you still exist. You hug your bear tighter because it's the last thing that smells like home. You wait for a letter, a knock, a rescue. You wait with your whole heart. And when you finally cry, it's not loud. It's a quiet kind of breaking, the kind children carry alone when the world forgets to care. That's what it feels like inside. Not dramatic, just wrong, deeply, quietly wrong. And you wonder if anyone anywhere still remembers your name. Nathan stood outside the modest but sharp-edged office of Kim Parker, his knuckles tight against the briefcase he hadn't opened in days. The brass plaque on the door, simple, clean, and quietly defiant, read, "Kim Parker, attorney at Law, Bioethics, Civil Rights, uncompromising." He hesitated only for a second before stepping in. The waiting room smelled like old paper and courage, and framed newspaper clippings lined the wall. Landmark victory against Gentech Biolabs. Parker shreds corporate immunity in genetic abuse case, the woman who made them listen. This was the person he needed, not someone polite or cautious, but someone who knew exactly how far the system could be stretched and how to make it snap. When Kim Parker entered, Nathan noticed not her size, but the gravity she carried. She didn't offer pleasantries, just motioned for him to sit and said, "Tell me why you're really here." And so for the first time with anyone other than Rachel, he told the whole story. The 5 children with no birth records, the sudden appearance of Stonewell Biotech, the courtroom, shutout, the schoolyard abduction dressed as legality, and the way the world now painted him as a dangerous outsider. Kim listened without blinking, her pen resting idle beside her notepad. When he finished, she didn't sigh or offer sympathy. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and said, "You're not asking for help. You're asking for war." Nathan didn't flinch. "I want them back. I want the truth out. And I want every hand that tried to bury these children's lives exposed to the light." For a moment there was silence. Then Kim nodded once. "Stonewell's protected. Their funding's federal. Their files are sealed. But they've made mistakes before. They were almost dismantled after the Maxwell gene therapy scandal. They survived by burying the children involved and silencing the nurses who spoke up." Nathan leaned forward. Rachel was one of those nurses. Kim's gaze sharpened. "Then she's not just a fugitive. She's a witness. And you, Mr. Brooks, are the man with nothing left to lose. That makes you dangerous." "Good." She stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a file thick with names, timelines, and signatures. "I've waited years for someone with the guts to bring this back to the surface. If you're ready to go all in, we start today. But know this, it won't just cost money. It'll cost peace, reputation, sleep. You'll be called a liar, a fool, maybe even a criminal." Nathan's voice didn't waver. "They're just kids. I'll give whatever it takes." Kim smiled, not warmly, but like someone unsheathing a blade. "Then let's begin." Nathan didn't sleep for days, and neither did Kim. Once they agreed to move forward, the operation unfolded with surgical precision and sleepless urgency. The first mission proof. Not just rumors or emotional pleas, but hard, indisputable evidence that would crack Stonewell's defense wide open. Step 1 was DNA. Through a contact Kim trusted in a private diagnostics lab, 2 states away, someone who owed her from a previous bioethics case, they arranged covert testing. Nathan still had the hairbrushes, toothbrushes, and pillowcases Rachel had saved obsessively, instinctively, as if she knew one day the truth would require more than memory. The samples were rushed under false names. Within 48 hours, the results came back. The 5 children shared remarkably similar genetic markers with anomalies that hinted at artificial gene editing, something no natural-born child should possess. One result in particular listed an unexplained synthetic methylation pattern in the genome, an echo of a controversial 2011 clinical trial banned in the U.S. That was the first strike. Next came surveillance. Getting access to internal footage from the facility where the children were now kept was nearly impossible. But Nathan used every resource he had left: old security contacts, a hacker he'd once mentored in a youth program, even an anonymous whistleblower forum where a former technician at the center had posted cryptic warnings. Within a week, they obtained several hours of footage from internal cameras that had been quietly backed up to a cloud server, likely without the company's knowledge. What the footage revealed was chilling children in identical gray clothes, all marked with wristbands that blinked red when they stepped out of a designated area. No outdoor time, no visitors. They sat in sterile classrooms with no color, no books except training modules, and were escorted in groups of 2 to locked dorms each night. A moment captured at 2:03 a.m. showed a child curled in a corner rocking silently while a guard walked past without even a glance. Kim watched the footage in silence, her jaw locked. "This isn't custody," she said. "This is containment." The final strike came from a garbage bag. Literally. A custodian at the center who had noticed Nathan's plea circulating on independent media anonymously sent them a photo of a discarded invoice found near the facility's pharmacy chute. It listed a monthly supply of recombinant growth hormone vials, unusually high doses for pediatric use, and traced back to a supplier known for prior violations involving unapproved substances. Kim sent the photo to a toxicology specialist who confirmed the codes were linked to a blacklisted formula previously used in banned trials for physical enhancement in children. "This is it," she said, her eyes blazing. "They're not just holding the kids. They're experimenting on them." With DNA proof of artificial manipulation, surveillance footage of psychological isolation, and billing documents tying Stonewall to illegal enhancement drugs, the case was no longer theory. It was a time bomb waiting to explode in court. All they had to do now was light the fuse. Rachel sat in the studio chair, her hands trembling beneath the table where the cameras couldn't see. The lights were hot. The makeup artist had left a faint layer of powder she hadn't bothered to fix, and the silence before the red light blinked on felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. For 17 years, she had lived in the shadows, a ghost in the system, hiding under fake names and forged documents, protecting the 5 children she had once smuggled out of a genetics lab that called itself a hospital. Now, as the cameras began to roll and the host gave a brief introduction about an unnamed whistleblower ready to speak out against one of the most powerful biotech firms in the country, Rachel knew there would be no going back. This was the moment she exposed herself not just to the public, but to the very people who had hunted her, who had built their empire on the lie that those children were never meant to live. She removed the scarf from her hair, pulled off the sunglasses, and stared directly into the lens. "My name is Rachel Whitman. I was a pediatric nurse at Stonewall Biotech until the day I discovered what they were doing to those children. Not patients, subjects, engineered, monitored, tested, and when deemed statistically irrelevant, scheduled for disposal." The host blinked in shock, clearly unprepared for the bluntness, but Rachel didn't pause. Her voice steadied as she spoke of how she had uncovered documents labeling the infants not by name, but as variations Alpha 3, Theta 5, Beta 9. She recalled the night she overheard a meeting between 2 lead scientists calmly discussing cerebral dissection plans to map cognitive elasticity. That was the night she took them. One at a time, wrapped in blankets, drugged to sleep, smuggled out during a fire alarm she'd triggered herself. She changed her identity, disappeared into a remote town, raised them with love and fear pressing against her chest every single day. I knew they would come, she said, her eyes shining but dry. And now they have. They took them from school like criminals. Those children are not lab assets. They are human beings. The interview cut to photos, blurry images of the children smiling in Maple Hollow holding hands in matching Halloween costumes sitting in a diner booth. When the host asked her what she hoped would come from this, Rachel answered without hesitation, "I want the world to see their faces. I want people to know that science without ethics is a machine. And I want my kids back." The broadcast ended in stunned silence. Within hours, the clip had gone viral. Hashtags exploded across social media. Protesters gathered outside Stonewell facilities. Rachel knew the danger. They might issue a warrant, discredit her, even arrest her. But none of that mattered now. Because for the first time, the lie was broken, and the world had finally seen the truth. The courtroom was packed to the brim before the bailiff even called for order, a suffocating tension buzzing in the air like static electricity. Every bench overflowed with bodies, journalists hunched over notepads, photographers jockeying for space legal interns with wide eyes, and dozens of Maple Hollow residents who had driven all night just to witness history unfold. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses aimed like rifles, while screens outside the courthouse streamed the proceedings to crowds gathered with picket signs, hot coffee, and trembling hope. Across the world, over 3 million viewers tuned into the live stream, numbers usually reserved for celebrity trials or election night, drawn by the impossible headline, "Billionaire Tech CEO Battles Biotech Giant Over Children Born in Secret." Social media platforms blazed with hashtags, or Stonewell Trial, "Let Them Come Home," "Science," or "Souls." The chatter wasn't just trending, it was consuming. Influencers weighed in with teary monologues. Scientists debated ethics on podcast panels, and mothers of adopted children posted raw videos demanding justice. But inside the courtroom, the mood was grave, almost holy, as though everyone knew this wasn't just about 5 stolen children. It was about the limits of power, the sanctity of parenthood, the cost of silence. Nathan sat stiffly beside Kim Parker, his jaw tight, suit, pressed eyes unmoving from the judge's bench. Rachel sat behind them, hands clenched, her face pale but steady, like a woman who had burned her own past to make a torch. At the prosecution table, Stonewell's lawyers spread out in arrogant formation, sharp suits, data binders, emotionless stares projecting the confidence of a billion-dollar fortress. But even they could feel it. The room wasn't theirs. This courtroom belonged to the children still locked in a facility with no windows, no phone calls, and names the world had never heard until now. As the gavel struck and silence fell, the battle for their freedom officially began under the scrutiny of a world finally paying attention. The lead attorney for Stonewell Biotech, Mr. Carlton Reed, rose slowly from his chair and adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision, the weight of his client's multi-billion-dollar interests radiating from every calculated gesture. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, polished to corporate perfection. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not a custody case in the traditional sense. This is a matter of intellectual property, scientific investment, and national interest." He turned to face the jury, his expression cool, rehearsed. Stonewell Biotech spent over 14 years developing the Gen 9 protocol, an innovative genetic sequencing model designed to eliminate hereditary disease, increase cognitive adaptability, and unlock physical potential. The 5 minors in question, subjects designated Beta 2 through Beta 6, are the direct result of that protocol. Our research team combined decades of scientific expertise, patented biomedical enhancements, and millions of dollars in federally approved funding. The embryos were cultivated in a controlled environment, screened for advanced neuroplasticity markers, and monitored under rigorous ethical parameters approved by internal review boards. The data from their development is irreplaceable. Let me be clear, these children are not victims of abduction or neglect. They were removed from unauthorized custody to ensure their health, safety, and scientific integrity. The woman known as Rachel Morgan, formerly Nurse Rachel Lindstrom, illegally extracted them from our secure research facility in a deliberate breach of contract and federal bioethics law. Her actions not only endangered their lives but compromised over a decade of medical progress. We understand the emotional framing the defense will attempt, but we urge the court to consider the legal precedent. If private individuals can abscond with proprietary biotech assets under the guise of maternal instinct, we open the floodgates to anarchy and scientific advancement. These children represent a future the world cannot afford to lose. Nathan stood slowly, his presence quiet but resolute, and when he spoke, the courtroom stilled. "Your Honor," he began, voice raw but unwavering, "we are not here to debate patents or biotech profits. We are here to defend 5 children. Children who laugh, cry, dream, and bleed like any others. Children who have names, not serial numbers. Who hold hands when they're scared and hum lullabies when they miss home. What the corporation calls assets, we call sons and daughters. What they reduce to experimental outcomes, we know as human beings with voices, emotions, and rights. No scientific breakthrough, no matter how advanced, gives anyone the right to claim ownership over another life. These children were never given a choice. They were created, monitored, and nearly dismantled under the false promise of progress. Rachel didn't steal property. She saved lives. She didn't escape with evidence. She escaped with babies, infants who would have been dissected like lab rats had she not acted. And now, after 7 years of giving them a home, a family, a future, we are told those years don't count because she wasn't authorized, because love and care and bedtime stories don't appear on legal documentation. He paused, then turned to Rachel, who sat beside him, tears in her eyes but her back straight. Rachel is not a kidnapper. She is the only mother these children have ever known. And I, while I may not share their blood, I have stood beside them, protected them, and chosen them every single day. Because children are not possessions. They are not test results or intellectual property. They are people. And if we allow a corporation to own them, we set a precedent that no child is safe. We ask this court not to legalize captivity, but to recognize humanity. Just as the courtroom tension reached its peak and the defense seemed to rest, a quiet moment rippled through the room. One of the children, the smallest girl with wide, solemn eyes and tightly braided hair, stood up from the front bench where she had been seated between 2 social workers. She held something in her hands, a folded piece of crinkled paper, the edges worn, as if it had been clutched for days. With hesitant steps, she approached the bench, and though the bailiff started to intervene, the judge raised a hand allowing her to proceed. The room fell into breathless silence. The girl unfolded the paper. At first glance, it looked like a child's drawing, a colorful scene of a building with tall walls, security cameras drawn like watchful eyes, and stick figures with ID badges. But then Rachel, her breath caught in her throat, leaned forward and whispered to Nathan, "That's not just a drawing, it's a cipher." The courtroom's digital forensic analyst present on standby was called up. Under the judge's direction, the analyst scanned the drawing into the system using enhancement tools and code recognition software. Layer by layer, colors began to shift, and symbols emerged, an embedded steganographic code hidden in crayon strokes. Within minutes, the system decoded a string of alphanumeric data linked to Stonewall's internal monitoring system, proving that biometric and behavioral surveillance had been active within the facility, tracking every move, every heartbeat, every private moment of the children without any public oversight or legal consent. The revelation stunned the room. The prosecution fumbled. Gasps erupted. A child had carried within her, drawing the very evidence that Stonewall denied existed. And in that moment, with trembling hands and a quiet gaze, the smallest voice in the courtroom delivered the loudest truth. The courtroom held its breath as the judge adjusted his glasses, the weight of the case heavy in the air. He looked out over the crowded room press lining the back wall, citizens watching through live stream, attorneys flanked by piles of evidence, and 3 children sitting quietly, eyes wide and waiting. This court, he began, his voice measured and resolute, recognizes the gravity of what has transpired, and the extraordinary efforts made not only to reveal the truth, but to protect the fundamental rights of these children. He paused, glancing briefly at Rachel, whose hands trembled in her lap, and then at Nathan, whose jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the judge with quiet defiance and hope. It is the ruling of this court, the judge continued, that all claims of corporate ownership, guardianship through genetic patent, and biometric possession by Stonewell Biotech are hereby dismissed as violations of both ethical law and human rights. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Effective, immediately legal guardianship of the minors known in this case shall be granted to Rachel Bennett, who, despite lacking formal paperwork, has demonstrated through testimony, evidence, and lived experience the consistent, nurturing presence of a mother. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, tears welling. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, recognizing the unwavering support and protective actions of Mr. Nathan Carter, who has not only sought legal recourse but shown emotional commitment to the well-being of the children, this court grants him legal status as co-guardian and shared custodial rights. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps, followed by restrained applause that even the bailiff did not silence. The children looked to Rachel then, to Nathan, then threw their arms around each other, overwhelmed by relief and joy. It was done. The court had spoken, not for the corporation, not for power, but for love, for truth, and for family. The little house on the edge of the woods was modest, weathered by time and softened by the quiet hum of trees swaying in the breeze. But to the 5 souls inside it was the most sacred place on earth. After everything, after courtrooms and cameras, accusations and isolation, heartbreak and reunion, it was here, in this small wooden cottage nestled between mossy rocks and wildflowers, that their new family truly began to take root. There were no marble countertops or security gates, no smart sensors tracking every step. Just creaky floorboards, hand-me-down mugs, and a kitchen table that had seen better days but now served as the beating heart of the home. In the mornings, sunlight would spill through the cracked windows, illuminating drawings the children had taped to the walls, some joyful, others still carrying the bruises of memory, but all part of the journey. Rachel would make tea and hum a tune from her childhood, the melody weaving through the house like a whispered promise. Nathan, once a man of boardrooms and blueprints, now spent hours sanding wood or fixing broken hinges, finding in every small repair a kind of healing he never knew he needed. The children played in the backyard, which wasn't much more than a clearing in the woods, chasing frogs and pretending the trees held secrets. Sometimes they would gather by the fireplace at night, reading stories or just sitting in silence, the crackle of the flames filling the spaces between their breaths. They had nothing flashy, but they had presence. They had peace. Most importantly, they had each other, no longer defined by loss or ownership or trauma, but by the daily choice to stay, to listen, to love. Here at the edge of the world, a real family was not only forming, it was finally free to grow. Homeschooling in the little house on the edge of the woods was nothing like the children's previous experiences. It was neither sterile nor regulated by cold routines and surveillance devices. Instead, each day unfolded like a quiet adventure shaped not by standardized tests, but by wonder, rhythm, and care. Rachel transformed the small living room into a learning sanctuary, scattering baskets of colored pencils, seed packets, and worn notebooks across a long wooden table. Mornings began with their fingers in soil, not on keyboards. The children learned biology by planting herbs and vegetables in raised beds Nathan built himself. They measured root growth, tracked sunlight, and named every sprout like a new friend. They learned patience not from punishment, but from waiting for strawberries to ripen or tomatoes to turn red. Art was no longer confined to worksheets, but splashed across wide pages and pine planks. With brushes and fingers, the children painted memories and dreams, houses they missed, skies they imagined, and sometimes shadows they couldn't name. Rachel never asked them to explain. She let the colors speak first. Each child kept a journal, a private space for scribbled questions, doodles, fragments of poetry, and letters they might never send. Nathan respected their notebooks like sacred texts he never read without permission, never corrected a word. Some days they read by the fireplace, their voices weaving through pages of distant worlds and histories. Other days learning happened outside, counting bird songs, mapping constellations, identifying animal tracks in mud. Education was no longer something done to them. It was something built with them. Slowly, the wounds left by clinical testing centers and locked doors began to fade, replaced by a different kind of knowing how to care for a plant. How to sit with a hard feeling. How to trust that love doesn't disappear when you make a mistake. This was not a curriculum, it was a reclamation. Nathan threw himself into rebuilding the little house, not as an escape from the world, but as a declaration of permanence, a quiet vow that this time he would stay. The once-forgotten cottage at the edge of the forest slowly transformed beneath his hands. He replaced rotting floorboards with reclaimed oak, sanded and varnished every surface until it shone with warmth. The walls, once faded and cold, were now lined with shelves of books, jars of seeds, and hand-drawn pictures from the children. He rebuilt the fireplace stone by stone, making it the heart of the home where stories were shared and tea simmered through rainy afternoons. But it was the chicken coop built from scratch behind the garden that became the true symbol of their new life. With sturdy cedar posts, hand-cut fencing, and a tin roof that echoed gently with every drop of rain, the coop stood as more than a shelter for hens. It was a gesture of continuity, of waking up each day to feed something that depended on them. The children helped paint it pale blue, decorated it with carved wooden signs, and named each hen like family. Every egg collected each morning became a ritual of reassurance. Life was growing. Something steady was unfolding. Nathan, who had once solved problems in boardrooms with metrics and strategy, now found deep satisfaction in fixing hinges, clearing gutters, and installing window boxes. His hands, once symbols of control, now learned the language of care. He didn't need applause or acknowledgement. The squeal of a child discovering a warm egg or the scent of fresh sawdust in the morning was enough. Through every hammer swing and nail driven, he was teaching without words that home was not built with money but with presence repair and the humble courage to begin again. Rachel converted the sunlit room at the back of the house, the one with wide windows facing the woods, into something more than a classroom. It became a sanctuary for forgotten children. She hung handmade curtains sewn from old fabric scraps, laid down soft rugs, and filled the shelves with books, art supplies, and jars of colored pencils sorted by shade. But it wasn't the materials that made the space extraordinary. It was the warmth, the way every child who stepped inside felt, seen, welcomed, and worthy. Word had spread quietly at first, a woman at the forest's edge offering lessons to kids who had no school to attend, no names in any official record, no paperwork proving they mattered. Rachel didn't ask for documents. She asked for stories, drawings, songs, anything the children were ready to give. She listened when no one else had. Children came hesitantly at first, eyes darting, shoulders tense, many of them carrying invisible weights. Some had been abandoned by the system, others hidden, others simply overlooked. Rachel taught them all. Not just math or reading, but how to plant tomatoes, how to name the birds they heard each morning, how to describe a memory without fear. She let them write letters they'd never send, paint the forests of their dreams, and build paper cities where no one was ever left behind. She refused to treat any child like a case or a file. Each was a person, a soul in need of place. And as the weeks passed, laughter returned to the room. One child learned to write her name for the first time. Another read a poem aloud, hands trembling. They painted murals on the back fence together, bright bursts of color that could be seen from the main road, proof that healing was happening, one lesson at a time. Rachel, who had once been hunted for loving children not born of her blood, was now building a world where they could all belong. Emma sat cross-legged on the old wooden porch, the journal resting in her lap like a fragile artifact. The pages had softened over time, edges curled with thumbprints and traces of crayon smudges, but the words inside were sharp, etched with the kind of truth a child doesn't always realize she's writing. As she flipped through the pages, her fingers trembled slightly. There were entries from the days at the center, observations of silence, whispers in the hallway, the smell of metal, the blinking red light beneath the skin on her wrist where the tracker had been. We were numbers then. One sentence read. Not names, not kids, not people. Emma paused, hearing the echo of that cold room where voices spoke in codes and doctors didn't smile. She turned the page. There, scrawled in her round, careful handwriting, was a line she barely remembered writing. They watched us like mice. But we learned to whisper when they turned away. She felt the lump rise in her throat. But what stopped her heart wasn't the memory of surveillance, it was what came after. A new entry, written months later with ink, that had bled just slightly from a drop of tear or rain. We used to be an experiment, she read aloud to herself, barely above a whisper, but now we're a family. The words pulled the air from her lungs, not because they were dramatic or poetic, but because they were simple and true. Around her she could hear the gentle cluck of chickens from the coop. Nathan had built the distant sound of laughter from the others as they ran through the trees, Rachel's soft humming as she hung laundry on the line. Emma looked up from the journal, her eyes sweeping over the house, the garden, the swing that still creaked even when no one sat on it. This wasn't a lab. This wasn't a case study. This was home, a place stitched together from broken pieces from children, once silenced, now learning to speak and be heard. And in that moment, as the journal rested against her chest, Emma knew the experiment hadn't failed, it had been rewritten by love. Emma stared out the window, watching the golden light of late afternoon spill across the edge of the forest, where the shadows of old secrets no longer lingered. The journal still rested in her lap, her thumb brushing the corner of the last page she had written in, but her thoughts were no longer trapped in the ink. They were drifting toward a man fixing a loose shutter on the side of the house, a man who once hesitated at the edge of their world, unsure if he deserved to enter. Nathan. Not a hero, not a savior. Just a man who, when everything fell apart, chose not to walk away. The others used to whisper stories about what rescue should look like. Some imagined a helicopter swooping in, others a court order served like lightning, even a grand speech on the courthouse steps. But none of that happened. What did happen was quieter, slower, almost too fragile to notice at first. Nathan came back. And then he stayed. When Rachel's voice cracked during late-night planning. When Emma had nightmares that made her scream in the dark. When little Ben refused to speak for weeks. Nathan stayed. He was there fixing floors, boiling soup, losing at board games on purpose, remembering birthdays that no one had celebrated before. And in the stillness between days, he earned something bigger than applause. He earned trust. Emma didn't need to say it out loud, but she would anyway because words mattered now. She picked up a pencil, turned to the final page, and wrote in firm, deliberate letters, "Dad, Nathan didn't rescue us. He just stayed." The truth of that statement held more weight than any legal victory, more power than any televised trial. Because rescue is often noisy, temporary, driven by ego. But staying, that requires love. Real, steady, imperfect love. And as she closed the journal for the last time and ran barefoot toward the garden where Nathan was calling her for dinner, she felt the deep, quiet certainty that the experiment was over. They were not subjects. They were a family. Not because someone saved them, but because someone chose to stay. The sun dipped low over the trees, casting long, amber shadows across the clearing behind the house, where the old wooden table stood beneath the wide arms of an oak. The table was simple, handmade by Nathan during those first months of rebuilding rough edges, smoothed by time knots in the grain left untouched like silent markers of imperfection and endurance. It had witnessed so much spilled juice, birthday candles, whispered secrets, morning lessons, and quiet tears wiped away when no one thought others were looking. But now something new had been added. On the surface of the table near the center, where all hands could reach, 7 names had been carved, not with precision, but with intention. Emma's name etched with careful curves and tiny stars dotting the sat beside Ben's blocky and crooked but bold. Next came Lily's, small and delicate like the child who once couldn't sleep through the night without nightmares. Then Rachel's name, deeper, steady, the anchor that had held them together through legal storms and unspeakable truths. Nathan's followed, not in the center, not towering, but nestled between the others, as if to say, I'm here, not above, but beside. 2 more names completed the ring, Noah and Grace, the twins who had once flinched at every loud sound, now laughing freely under the sun. Their names were the newest, still a little uneven, the wood around them lighter. Together the names told a story no court could write, and no reporter could capture, of children once considered property, now authors of their own belonging. Of a man who was once a stranger, now a father, not by biology but by choice. Of a woman once afraid to speak, now teaching others to use their voices. The table, worn but strong, didn't shimmer or shine. It simply stood there, unmoving, unfailing, like the love that had carved those 7 names into its grain. It was not a monument. It was a promise that here they were no longer experiments or numbers or subjects. Here they were home. Family is not built on biology or bound by the invisible threads of DNA. It is not determined by shared bloodlines matching last names or legal certificates tucked into drawers. Family, in its truest and most unshakable form, is made by those who choose to stay when the world gives every excuse to leave. Nathan was not related to the children by blood. He had no legal claim. At first, no biological tether to pull him toward them. And yet, when the truth shattered the illusion of order, when the corporation exposed its monstrous logic and the children were treated like intellectual property, Nathan chose something no contract could enforce. He stayed. Through courtrooms thick with press, through nights when Emma could not sleep, and Noah silently cried behind the barn, through Rachel's fear of failing them, all he remained. That choice, repeated day after day, became the foundation upon which a real family was slowly, stubbornly built. The children, once abandoned by systems and strangers, began to unlearn their fear of being disposable. They came to understand that love wasn't proved by gifts or promises, but by presence, by who sat with them when they were sick, who listened when words were broken, who showed up when it was easier not to. Rachel, too, was not their mother in the way courts defined it. She hadn't birthed them, but she fed them, taught them, shielded them, and named their pain aloud when no one else dared. In doing so, she became more than a guardian. She became their heart. This family, born not of blood but of choice, resilience, and quiet bravery, was proof that love, when rooted in staying, is stronger than legacy. And perhaps that is the truth the world most needs to hear, that the ones who stay, especially when it's hardest, are the ones who become our true family. In real life, we often believe that family is something we're born into, a fixed truth shaped by bloodlines and ancestry. But stories like this remind us that family at its deepest level is a choice. It's not about perfect genetics or picture-perfect holidays. It's about who stays when things get messy. Who shows up when there's no applause, who listens without judgment, sits in the silence with you, and chooses over and over again to walk beside you, even when the world tells them they don't have to. In a world that moves too fast and often values appearance over presence, the real heroes are the ones who stay, the ones who pick up the phone even when they don't have the words, the ones who bring dinner when you didn't ask, The ones who make a place at the table not because they have to, but because their heart insists on it. And if you've ever felt alone, unloved, or like you didn't belong, know this family can still be found. Sometimes in a teacher, sometimes in a neighbor, sometimes in someone who sees your pain and doesn't turn away. So choose presence over perfection. Choose to be the person who stays. Because the legacy we leave behind won't be the titles we earn or the things we own. It will be the people we stood by and the love we gave without conditions. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who stayed or someone you chose as family, let us know in the comments. Share your story. Save this video if it touched your heart. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of what truly matters. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind someone they're not alone.